The fence didn't go up to start a war. It went up because the boundary had always been there, even when the neighborhood pretended it wasn't. Long before the matching mailboxes and identical porch lights, long before the landscaped entrance sign and the monthly dues, the property line had been written into county records with survey pins hammered deep into stubborn soil. The land had a history, and history doesn't vanish just because someone prints new rules on glossy paper and calls it community standards. The neighborhood around my place was the kind of development that looked calm from a distance and felt tight up close. Streets were wide, lawns were cut like carpets, and every house sat with the same polite posture, as if architecture itself had been trained not to stand out. People smiled in passing, but the smiles were measured. The kind that said they saw you and they were already taking notes. It was not a place built for privacy. It was a place built for compliance. My lot was the problem from day one, and not because I was messy or loud or reckless. My lot was the problem because it was older. It stretched farther back than the others, angled slightly where the developer had tried to square off nature into a neat grid. My property ran along the edge of a drainage corridor and an old utility easement that had existed for decades, long before anyone planted decorative trees in perfect lines. The developer had built the neighborhood near it, not over it, because the county wouldn't allow it. That strip of land wasn't optional. It was functional. It carried water when storms hit. It carried underground lines that kept the neighborhood alive. When I bought the place, the realtor called it a unique boundary. The paperwork called it something else, a legally recorded parcel with specific easements that could not be obstructed, relocated, or ignored without county approval and utility coordination. That wasn't a fun detail for small talk, but it was the kind of detail that mattered when everyone around you started acting like the neighborhood's rules were more powerful than the law. The fence was simple, durable, built to last and built to mark what was mine. It followed the surveyed line precisely, not an inch beyond. It didn't cut off anyone's driveway. It didn't block sight lines. It didn't trap anyone's dog or shade anyone's roses. It just stood there, firm and unbothered, doing what fences have done for centuries, telling the truth in a straight line. That's what made the HOA nervous. At first, the tension was subtle, the way it always starts in neighborhoods where control is treated like a hobby. A slowed-down car, a neighbor who used to wave now staring too long, a man pretending to jog but taking the same route past my fence every day. It was the quiet curiosity of people who didn't like being reminded that the world had edges they couldn't reshape. Then came the first letter. It arrived crisp, official, and unnecessarily dramatic, like it had been written for a courtroom audience instead of a mailbox. It informed me that my fence was non-compliant with community aesthetic guidelines. It referenced rules I had never agreed to and standards I had never signed. It included a deadline, a warning, and a threat of escalating penalties. The letter assumed I was part of them. It assumed their authority extended past their own sidewalks and into county records. It assumed that intimidation, formatted neatly and stamped with confidence, was the same thing as legal power. I didn't panic because I'd seen this behavior before, not from this HOA specifically, but from the type of people who treat paperwork like a weapon and assume the other person will fold before anyone checks the facts. I read the letter twice, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to understand the mindset behind it. The language wasn't just demanding, it was possessive, as if the neighborhood didn't just want the fence gone, but wanted the idea of resistance gone with it. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't rush into explanations. I did what people rarely do when they're being pressured. I got quiet and got precise. I pulled out my closing documents. I printed the survey. I reviewed the recorded plat. I highlighted the utility easement along the back edge of the development and the drainage corridor that ran like a hidden spine behind the neat rows of houses. Then I did something that felt almost funny, given how aggressively confident the HOA letter had been. I checked whether they actually had jurisdiction over my property. They didn't, not even close. My property was not part of the HOA, and that wasn't a technicality. It was a foundational fact. I wasn't paying dues because I wasn't obligated to. I wasn't attending meetings because I wasn't a member. The neighborhood had been built next to me, not around me. Somewhere along the years, as boards changed and people moved in and out, the HOA had apparently started telling itself a story that was convenient, that everything near them belonged to them, and now my fence was interrupting that story. The second letter came faster, as if the first one had been a test, and I'd failed by not reacting. This one included final notice, a language, and a more detailed threat of enforcement action. It spoke about fines. It hinted at legal steps. It implied they could send someone to remove the fence and bill me for it. It was written with the kind of confidence that only comes from never being challenged. What it didn't include was anything that mattered outside their bubble. No county ordinance references, no survey contradictions, no proof of authority, just louder words. By the end of that week, the HOA attention stopped being paper only. A vehicle parked near the fence line more often. A man took photos from the sidewalk like he was building evidence for a case that didn't exist. Someone placed a small orange tag near one of my fence posts, the way utilities mark lines before digging, except this tag was cheap and unofficial, as if they wanted it to look serious from a distance. It was childish, but it wasn't harmless, because the moment an HOA starts acting like it can physically interfere with your property, the game changes. It stops being about aesthetics and starts being about entitlement with tools. I walked the fence line that evening, checking every post and panel, confirming nothing had been loosened or tampered with. The fence was solid. It wasn't going anywhere, but the feeling in the air was different now. It wasn't neighborhood irritation anymore. It was escalation. And the thing about escalation is that most bullies only escalate when they think you're outnumbered. I wasn't outnumbered. I just hadn't played my hand yet. Because my fence wasn't just on a property line. It was on the edge of something the HOA depended on, even if they didn't realize it. Access to the utility corridor and the drainage easement that kept their entire block functional. Most homeowners never think about easements. They treat them like invisible zones that only matter when a worker in a reflective vest shows up. But easements are the quiet backbone of neighborhoods. They decide who can access what, who can cross where, and who has the right to maintain the systems that keep the lights on and the water moving. That corridor ran alongside my land, and parts of it could only be reached efficiently through my side, not from the HOA manicured streets. Over time, utility crews had used informal access paths. Drainage maintenance teams had crossed certain points. The developer had relied on the existing layout. The HOA, in its obsession with appearance, had slowly tried to beautify. Parts of it planting shrubs and placing decorative rocks where function should have stayed clear. They didn't know how close they were to crossing a line that would cost them more than embarrassment. The next morning, I received a third letter. This one wasn't mailed. It was hand-delivered, slipped into my mailbox in a way that made it feel like someone wanted to remind me they were close enough to touch my property whenever they wanted. It repeated the demand, remove the fence or face consequences. I stood in my kitchen, holding the paper, and felt something settle in my chest. Not fear, not anger, something colder and more focused. The kind of clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are and what they're willing to do. They wanted the fence gone. They thought they could force it. They thought they controlled the neighborhood, and by extension, controlled anything near it. They had no idea the fence wasn't the threat. The fence was the warning. That evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the neighborhood's perfect lawns into long shadows, I sat down with my documents spread out like a map of reality. Survey lines, easement language, county codes, utility contact information, and recorded plats. The HOA had been playing a game of intimidation. I was about to shift it into a game of law, infrastructure, and consequences. Not revenge, not destruction, something cleaner, something official. The kind of move that doesn't just stop an HOA from bothering you, but makes them realize they've been standing on a trapdoor the whole time. By the time I closed my folder and turned off the light, the plan wasn't vague anymore. It was structured, it was legal, and it was going to hit them where it hurt the most, the part of their neighborhood they couldn't bully, fine, or vote away. The next chapter wouldn't start with another letter. It would start with a phone call that the HOA board never imagined I had the power to make. The morning after the third letter, the neighborhood looked the same on the surface, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that only someone paying attention would notice. Cars still lined the driveways with military precision. Lawns were still trimmed down to uniform heights. Decorative flags still fluttered in the mild breeze, carefully chosen to avoid offending anyone on the HOA board. But underneath that calm presentation sat a fragile assumption, that control only flows one way. I didn't rush into action. Rushing is what HOA expect. Panic responses, emotional emails, defensive explanations. That's how they win most of their battles. They overwhelm homeowners with process and pressure until compliance feels easier than resistance. I wasn't interested in making it easy for them. I wanted it to be expensive, exhausting, and embarrassing. I started with the county, not a complaint, not a demand, just confirmation. I verified the recorded easements tied to my property, the drainage corridor classification, and the access language that had been written decades before the HOA existed. The clerk was efficient and neutral, the way people are when they deal in facts instead of neighborhood politics. Everything checked out. The easement wasn't decorative, it wasn't optional. It was essential infrastructure, and interference with it carried consequences that went far beyond HOA fines. Next came the utilities: power, water, drainage management, and telecom. Each call followed the same pattern. I explained that there was a dispute involving access near a recorded easement, and asked what their official policy was regarding obstruction, unauthorized landscaping, and restricted entry points. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't accuse, I let them talk. What they told me was far more useful than anything the HOA had written. Utility companies don't care about neighborhood aesthetics. They care about access, safety, and liability. If an easement is blocked, altered, or interfered with, their response isn't polite letters. It's inspections, notices, and sometimes immediate corrective action. They also don't negotiate with homeowners associations the way HOA expect. The easement grants them authority that overrides local rules, decorative plans, and community guidelines. By mid-morning, I had documentation from multiple departments outlining their right to uninterrupted access through the easement corridor and their expectation that property owners, mine included, maintain clear entry points for maintenance and emergency work. One of them casually mentioned that they'd had trouble accessing certain sections of that neighborhood in the past due to landscaping and fencing choices made without proper coordination. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. The HOA hadn't just been overconfident with me. They'd been quietly pushing boundaries for years, assuming no one would challenge them because no one wanted to deal with the hassle. I was about to introduce them to the hassle. The fence, ironically, was fully compliant with the easement requirements. It didn't block access. It followed the survey. It respected the setback distances. The HOA decorative additions, however, were another story. Shrubs planted too close to drainage paths, decorative rocks narrowing access lanes, fences built by HOA members that encroached inches at a time until access routes became suggestions instead of guarantees. That's what happens when people mistake silence for permission. I compiled everything into a single packet: clean, organized, unemotional, county confirmations, utility policies, survey maps, easement language highlighted in plain terms. Then I drafted one letter, not to the HOA membership, not to the neighborhood, to the HOA board, addressed individually, so no one could claim ignorance later. The letter didn't threaten, it informed. It clarified that my property was not under HOA jurisdiction, that the fence was legally placed, and that continued attempts to interfere with it would be documented as harassment and property interference. Then it shifted focus, gently but unmistakably, to the easement. I noted that recent HOA landscaping and boundary decisions appeared to interfere with recorded utility access and drainage maintenance requirements, and that I had been advised by multiple utility providers to report any obstruction that could delay emergency or routine service. I didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. I simply stated that if access issues continued, I would have no choice but to formally request inspections to protect my own legal obligations tied to the easement. That was the pivot, because easements don't just grant rights, they impose responsibilities. If something goes wrong, flooding, power outages, infrastructure damage, the property owners tied to the easement can be held accountable for failing to report or prevent interference. The HOA, in trying to bully me, had put me in a position where silence could be interpreted as negligence. I mailed the letters certified. Then I waited. The reaction wasn't immediate, but it was visible. Within a day, the jogger stopped passing my fence. The parked vehicle disappeared. The cheap orange tag vanished without explanation. That kind of quiet retreat doesn't happen unless someone higher up has started asking uncomfortable questions. By the end of the week, the HOA board called a special meeting. Flyers appeared on doors, phrased vaguely enough to avoid panic, but urgent enough to spark speculation. Residents gathered in small groups at the mailbox cluster, whispering and pointing toward the back of the development where my property line met the easement corridor. Rumors spread faster than facts ever do. Words like inspection and utilities floated through conversations, often paired with nervous laughter and disbelief. Most homeowners had no idea what an easement actually meant beyond the vague sense that it was some legal thing. They certainly didn't understand how much of their neighborhood depended on access that ran along land the HOA didn't own and didn't control. The board, however, understood enough to be afraid. That fear didn't turn into humility. It turned into desperation. I received an email, not a letter this time, requesting a neighborly discussion about the fence and mutual concerns. The tone was suddenly cooperative, almost friendly, as if the previous weeks of threats and posturing had never happened. They suggested compromises, visual adjustments, alternative designs, anything that would let them feel like they were still in charge of the outcome. I didn't respond. Instead, I made one more call. This time, I formally requested an easement access review due to ongoing disputes and potential obstruction. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't assign blame. I simply asked for clarity and documentation. Utility companies love documentation. Counties love records. Once a process like that starts, it doesn't stop because an HOA feels embarrassed. The inspection was scheduled for the following week. Notices went out automatically, not just to me, but to the HOA and affected property owners along the corridor. Suddenly, homeowners who had never spoken to me were knocking on my door, asking careful questions, trying to understand what was happening without admitting how worried they were. I stayed calm. I explained facts. I didn't reassure anyone beyond what was accurate, because reassurance wasn't my responsibility. Truth was, the HOA board sent another email, then another. Their language shifted from assertive to defensive to vaguely accusatory, as if I had created the problem by refusing to remove a fence that had never been theirs to regulate. They hinted at legal costs. They hinted at community disruption. They hinted that I was being unreasonable. What they never did was deny the easement issue, because they couldn't. By the time the inspection date approached, the neighborhood's confidence had cracked. People started noticing things they'd ignored before. The way stormwater pooled longer than it should. The narrow paths behind their fences where workers were supposed to go. The overgrown shrubs that looked pretty but served no function. Control works best when people don't understand the systems beneath them. Once they do, the illusion collapses. The fence, once a symbol of defiance in the HOA eyes, had become irrelevant. It wasn't the fight anymore. The fight was about access, liability, and who would be blamed if the infrastructure failed. As the week ended, I stood near the fence at dusk, watching the lights come on across the block. Every house glowing, powered by systems they rarely thought about, all tied together by corridors and lines that didn't care about neighborhood politics. The HOA had tried to assert dominance with threats and letters. I had answered with process, and process doesn't get emotional. It doesn't back down because someone raises their voice. It just keeps moving forward, dragging consequences behind it. The next chapter wouldn't be about my property anymore. It would be about the entire block, realizing how fragile their sense of control really was. The inspection notices did what no HOA newsletter ever could. They made people pay attention. Overnight, a neighborhood that thrived on routine and predictability found itself confronted with uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing control-driven communities cannot tolerate. The paper notices, posted near mailboxes and sent through official channels, didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but they didn't need to. The language alone was enough to rattle nerves. Phrases about access verification, easement compliance, and infrastructure review carried a weight that no decorative guideline ever could. At first, the confusion was quiet. Homeowners reread the notices, trying to decode what applied to them and what didn't. Many assumed it was a mistake, a formality, something that would resolve itself if ignored. That belief lasted until people started comparing notes. The corridor in question wasn't some obscure strip of land hidden far from their homes. It ran behind fences, alongside backyards, under walking paths they used daily. It was close enough that once attention turned toward it, its presence felt suddenly intrusive. The HOA board attempted damage control almost immediately. An email went out framing the inspection as routine coordination and urging residents not to worry. The tone was carefully neutral, but the timing betrayed them. Boards don't reassure unless there's something to be reassured about. That subtle contradiction didn't go unnoticed, especially by homeowners who had spent years watching the HOA enforce rules with surgical precision. If the board was nervous, something serious had to be at stake. Questions began spreading faster than answers. People started walking the back edges of their properties, noticing things they'd taken for granted for years. Decorative fences that extended just a little too far, storage sheds placed conveniently close to tree lines, landscaping that looked intentional but now seemed oddly positioned. The more people looked, the more they realized how much of the neighborhood's order depended on assumptions no one had ever challenged. I became a point of reference, whether I wanted to or not. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before approached carefully, asking general questions without committing to opinions. They didn't accuse, and they didn't defend the HOA outright. They were trying to understand where the ground was shifting beneath them. I answered factually, without emotion or speculation. I explained what an easement was, why access mattered, and how utilities treated obstruction. I didn't frame myself as a victim or a crusader. I framed the situation as a matter of systems meeting reality. That approach unsettled people more than anger ever could. Anger can be dismissed as personal. Facts linger. As the days passed, subtle divisions formed. Some homeowners clung to loyalty, insisting the HOA would handle it, and that the issue was being exaggerated. Others grew quietly resentful, recalling past fines, warnings, and rigid enforcement over issues far smaller than infrastructure access. Those memories, once dismissed as annoyances, started to feel relevant. If the HOA had been willing to threaten penalties over mailbox colors and lawn edging, what would they do now that the stakes were higher? The board responded with another message, longer this time, full of reassuring language and vague promises of cooperation. It emphasized unity, community values, and the importance of presenting a cohesive front. That phrase landed poorly. People didn't want a front, they wanted clarity. The absence of specifics did more harm than good, because it confirmed what many suspected. The board was reacting, not leading. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Utility representatives began requesting access maps and clarification on past modifications near the corridor. County officials asked for documentation related to landscaping approvals. The HOA paper trail, once focused almost entirely on aesthetics, suddenly felt thin where it mattered most. Decisions that had been made casually, justified as improvements or beautification efforts, were now being re-examined through a lens of liability. The fence that started everything faded from the conversation entirely. It wasn't mentioned in emails anymore. No one photographed it. No one tagged it. It stood exactly where it had always stood, unchanged, while the neighborhood's attention shifted inward. That silence around the fence was telling. It wasn't compliance that stopped the HOA pressure. It was fear of what pressing further might reveal. Homeowners began asking questions the board couldn't answer cleanly. Would anyone be required to remove structures? Who would pay if changes were mandated? Could fines be issued retroactively? Each question chipped away at the image of absolute authority the HOA had cultivated. Authority depends on confidence, and confidence collapses when answers turn uncertain. The board scheduled another meeting, this one closed, citing legal sensitivity. That decision backfired almost immediately. Closed meetings breed suspicion, especially in communities trained to expect transparency only when it serves control. People speculated openly, filling the gaps with worst-case scenarios, flooding risks. Power disruptions, unexpected assessments. The fear wasn't of me or my fence anymore. It was of consequences they had never considered because they'd trusted someone else to think about them. I watched the shift from a distance, careful not to insert myself unnecessarily. The moment wasn't about proving I was right. It was about letting the process unfold naturally. Systems, once activated, don't need constant encouragement. They apply pressure evenly without regard for social hierarchy or neighborhood politics. By the time the inspection date was just days away, the HOA board's posture had changed entirely. Their communications grew cautious, almost legalistic. Words were chosen carefully. Commitments were avoided. Responsibility was diffused. That change didn't reassure anyone. It confirmed what many had already concluded. The board was out of its depth. The neighborhood that once enforced conformity through fear of fines was now experiencing a different kind of fear, one rooted in uncertainty and exposure. People realized that control without understanding is fragile, and that rules enforced aggressively can mask deeper vulnerabilities. As the chapter closed, the atmosphere felt heavier, quieter, like the moment before a storm breaks. The inspection hadn't happened yet, but its shadow already stretched across the block. The HOA had tried to assert dominance over a fence. Instead, it had drawn attention to the foundations beneath the neighborhood, foundations it no longer fully controlled. The next chapter would bring official eyes to the corridor, and with them, answers no amount of carefully worded emails could soften. The day of the inspection arrived without ceremony, which somehow made it more unsettling. There were no sirens, no announcements, no visible drama to warn the neighborhood that something consequential was underway. Instead, a small convoy of marked vehicles appeared near the edge of the development early in the morning, parked with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having authority without needing to display it. People noticed anyway. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway open. Morning routines slowed as residents tried to observe without appearing curious. The inspectors moved methodically, carrying clipboards and tablets, walking the easement corridor with practiced attention. They didn't rush and they didn't chat. Their focus wasn't on appearances or intentions, but on alignment. Whether reality matched what the record said should exist. Measurements were taken. Photos were logged. Notes were made with neutral expressions that gave nothing away. That neutrality was unnerving because it left no room for reassurance or negotiation. The HOA board was present, but noticeably restrained. Board members hovered at a distance, careful not to interfere, offering assistance only when requested. The shift in their demeanor was stark compared to the confidence they displayed in letters and emails just weeks earlier. Now, they spoke softly and deferred often, as if hoping compliance in tone might compensate for overreach in action. Homeowners gathered in small clusters, pretending to discuss unrelated matters while watching the process unfold. The inspection forced people to confront how little they actually understood about the systems woven beneath their neighborhood. What had once been invisible now felt exposed. The easement corridor, previously treated as wasted space or a decorative afterthought, was revealed as a critical pathway that had been narrowed, obscured, and modified in ways no one had seriously questioned. The inspector's attention lingered in several areas, particularly where landscaping encroached on access routes. Decorative stone borders, thick hedges, and fences built by individual homeowners came under scrutiny. The issue wasn't malicious intent, it was accumulation. One small decision after another, each justified as harmless, had gradually transformed a functional corridor into a constrained one. The HOA approval process, designed to enforce uniformity, had inadvertently facilitated obstruction. As the morning progressed, tension spread. Conversations grew quieter. People stopped speculating aloud and started calculating privately. If changes were required, who would be responsible? The HOA that approved the modifications, or the homeowners who installed them? The ambiguity was unsettling, especially for residents who had trusted the board's guidance without question. The fence on my property received attention too, but briefly. The inspectors noted its placement, checked measurements against the survey, and moved on. There was no discussion, no concern, no lingering doubt. That moment, small as it was, carried weight. It quietly validated what the HOA had refused to accept from the beginning, that legality doesn't bend to preference. By midday, the inspection concluded. The officials didn't announce findings or offer commentary. They packed up and left as efficiently as they'd arrived, taking their notes and silence with them. That silence was heavier than any accusation could have been. Without immediate answers, the neighborhood filled the void with imagination. The HOA board sent out a message that afternoon, carefully worded and conspicuously noncommittal. It thanked residents for their cooperation and reiterated that the inspection was part of an ongoing review process. It promised updates once information became available. The message avoided acknowledging any issues, but the effort to appear calm only highlighted the underlying anxiety. Homeowners reacted in different ways. Some dismissed the inspection as a formality, clinging to the belief that nothing significant would come of it. Others began preparing mentally for disruption, replaying past interactions with the HOA, and wondering whether the same rigid enforcement would now apply in reverse. The possibility that the board might face consequences unsettled those who had relied on its authority to maintain order. Behind closed doors, the board faced a reality it could no longer manage through tone alone. Requests for documentation increased. Follow-up questions arrived from utility companies and county offices. Clarifications were needed regarding approvals, modifications, and maintenance responsibilities. Each request chipped away at the narrative of control the HOA had cultivated. The neighborhood's mood shifted from curiosity to unease. People began questioning decisions they'd never scrutinized before. Why had certain changes been approved so easily? Why hadn't access requirements been emphasized? The answers, when offered, were unsatisfying: convenience, assumptions, a belief that no one would ever look too closely. I observed the aftermath quietly. There was no satisfaction in watching the tension spread, only a sense of inevitability. Systems don't fail dramatically at first. They strain, then reveal weaknesses slowly, forcing everyone involved to confront the consequences of neglect. The HOA had prioritized appearance over function for years, confident that enforcement power would shield it from accountability. The inspection stripped that shield away. As days passed, subtle changes appeared. Landscaping crews trimmed back hedges without explanation. Homeowners removed decorative elements near the corridor preemptively, hoping to avoid future mandates. These actions weren't coordinated, but they shared a common motivation: fear of being singled out. The community that once enforced conformity now reacted individually, each household trying to minimize risk. The board's communications became infrequent and cautious. Meetings were postponed. Updates were promised but delayed. The absence of decisive leadership eroded trust faster than any fine ever could. People began to realize that authority built on enforcement alone collapses when enforcement turns inward. The chapter closed with a sense of suspended momentum. The inspection had ended, but its implications were only beginning to surface. The HOA had lost the initiative, and with it, the confidence that had fueled its earlier aggression. The fence that started the conflict stood unchanged, a quiet reminder that boundaries exist whether or not people choose to respect them. The next chapter would bring results, and with them, a reckoning the neighborhood could no longer avoid. The report didn't arrive with drama, but it carried more weight than any threat the HOA had ever issued. It came through official channels, copied to the HOA board, utility departments, and county offices, written in language that was dry, precise, and completely indifferent to neighborhood politics. There were no emotional cues to soften it, no warnings meant to prepare anyone for what it contained. It simply stated findings, referenced codes, and outlined required actions. The kind of document that doesn't argue because it doesn't need to. By the time homeowners became aware that the report existed, the board was already scrambling. Emergency emails went out, stripped of the confident tone that once defined HOA communication. Words like assessment, coordination, and next steps appeared repeatedly, while responsibility remained carefully unnamed. The board avoided summaries, avoided explanations, and most of all avoided acknowledging fault. That avoidance was its own admission. The findings were straightforward and devastating in their simplicity. The easement corridor had been compromised, not catastrophically, not maliciously, but systematically. Over time, approved modifications had narrowed access paths, reduced clearance, and created potential delays for maintenance and emergency response. In multiple locations, decorative elements approved by the HOA directly conflicted with utility access requirements. The report didn't speculate on intent. It didn't care why the decisions were made. It only documented what existed and why it couldn't remain that way. The fence, once again, was mentioned only in passing. It was noted as compliant, properly placed, and non-obstructive. That single line quietly dismantled weeks of HOA posturing. Everything they had framed as a problem was now irrelevant. The actual issues were internal, cumulative, and undeniable. What unsettled the neighborhood most wasn't the list of required corrections. It was the structure of accountability. The report made it clear that responsibility didn't rest solely on individual homeowners or solely on the HOA. It rested on both. Approvals granted without proper consideration created shared liability. That distinction mattered. It meant no one could hide behind the board, and the board couldn't hide behind the residents. Panic followed clarity. Homeowners who had never questioned an approval letter now reread them with dread. Those approvals, once treated as shields, suddenly felt like liabilities. The realization spread quietly but relentlessly. Compliance with HOA rules did not guarantee compliance with the law. The board attempted to regain control by calling another meeting, this one framed as an informational session. Attendance was higher than it had been in years, but the mood was nothing like previous gatherings. There was no chatter, no small talk, no casual complaints about parking or paint colors. People arrived tense, arms crossed, eyes alert. The trust that once allowed the board to speak without interruption was gone. The presentation was cautious and incomplete. The board summarized the report selectively, emphasizing cooperation and downplaying urgency, but homeowners had already seen enough. Copies circulated privately. Excerpts were shared. People compared notes and realized how much had been omitted. The gap between what was said and what was written widened the fracture. Questions poured in, not angrily, but insistently. Who approved the landscaping? Who verified access requirements? Why weren't utilities consulted earlier? Each question forced the board to retreat into vague answers about past leadership and evolving standards. That strategy failed quickly. The report referenced specific dates and approvals. History could no longer be blurred. Outside the meeting, the neighborhood changed. People stopped blaming me, if they ever truly had. The narrative shifted from an individual dispute to a systemic failure. The fence was no longer controversial. It was invisible. What people saw now were the hedges they'd admired, the fences they'd installed, the choices they'd trusted someone else to vet. Corrective actions began almost immediately. Notices went out requiring homeowners along the corridor to remove or modify certain features. Deadlines were set. Inspections were scheduled. The HOA tried to frame these actions as proactive compliance, but the urgency betrayed them. This wasn't initiative, it was reaction. Financial anxiety followed. Costs were estimated. Responsibility debated. The possibility of special assessments loomed, the very outcome the HOA had once warned residents about in unrelated disputes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I watched all of this from the same distance I'd maintained since the beginning. There was no celebration, no satisfaction, just a steady awareness that systems correct themselves eventually, often in ways that feel personal even when they aren't. The HOA had threatened my fence as a display of power. That display had triggered scrutiny. Scrutiny had revealed weakness. As the chapter closed, the neighborhood stood at a crossroads. The illusion of absolute control was gone, replaced by accountability that no one could vote away. The board still existed, still held meetings, still sent emails, but its authority had been redefined. The next chapter would show what happens when a community built on enforcement is forced to confront consequences it can't outsource or ignore. The first visible sign that the HOA grip was weakening wasn't dramatic. There were no resignations, no public apologies, no sudden reversals of tone. Instead, it showed up in hesitation. Emails took longer to arrive. Decisions that once came swiftly were delayed under the guise of review. The board, that had once acted with absolute certainty, now moved like it, was afraid of touching anything without gloves. That hesitation spoke louder than any admission ever could. Homeowners felt it immediately. The rhythm of enforcement that had defined the neighborhood for years began to stutter. Minor violations went unaddressed. Notices that once arrived like clockwork stopped appearing. People noticed, and they remembered. For a long time, the HOA authority had felt permanent, unquestionable, like gravity. Now it felt conditional, dependent on circumstances beyond its control. Along the easement corridor, activity increased. Contractors hired by individual homeowners rushed to remove or adjust features flagged in the report. Shrubs were pulled out. Decorative stone was hauled away. Sections of fencing were dismantled with visible frustration. Each correction carried a quiet resentment, not necessarily toward the HOA, but toward the realization that compliance hadn't protected anyone. It had only delayed scrutiny. The board tried to manage the fallout with careful language, emphasizing shared responsibility and community cooperation. But those words rang hollow now. Cooperation feels different when it's voluntary. When it's demanded after years of rigid enforcement, it feels like deflection. Homeowners who had once deferred to the board's judgment began pushing back, asking for written justification, third-party verification, and timelines that made sense. The same scrutiny the HOA had once imposed on residents was now being turned inward. Meetings became tense, not loud, but heavy. Silence filled gaps where agreement used to live. People listened carefully, weighing every word the board said against the report they'd read and the corrections they were paying for. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned, and the board didn't know how to earn it without surrendering control. Behind the scenes, the HOA legal counsel grew more involved. Communications adopted a cautious tone, stripped of personality. Everything was filtered, approved, and delayed. That shift further eroded confidence. Legal language protects organizations, not relationships. The more the HOA hid behind it, the more residents felt abandoned. The irony was unavoidable. The same board that had threatened fines and enforcement over my fence now avoided decisive action even when infrastructure demanded it. Authority, once wielded aggressively, became paralyzed under accountability. People noticed the contrast, and it changed how they viewed every past interaction. Rules that once felt absolute now seemed arbitrary. Penalties that had once felt inevitable now felt negotiable. I remained largely absent from the conversation by design. In communities like this, narratives look for villains and heroes, but neither role lasts. What lasts is precedent. The HOA had set a precedent by overreaching, and that precedent had triggered a process they couldn't stop. My involvement was already complete. Everything else was consequence. Still, the ripple effects reached me. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now nodded quietly. Some expressed relief, others curiosity, a few awkward gratitude. I accepted none of it personally. This wasn't about winning social approval. It was about restoring balance in a system that had confused control with authority. The board attempted one last maneuver to reclaim its image. They proposed updated guidelines, revised processes, and a renewed commitment to transparency. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it felt rushed and defensive. Homeowners weren't interested in new rules. They wanted assurance that old mistakes wouldn't be repeated. As weeks passed, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm. Corrections continued. Inspections followed. Costs were absorbed grudgingly. The HOA still existed, but it no longer felt omnipotent. It felt watched. That was the true shift. Power had changed hands not through confrontation, but through exposure. The fence still stood, unchanged and unremarkable, blending back into the background as if it had never been controversial. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment the HOA revealed its misunderstanding of limits. As the chapter ended, one truth had become clear to everyone involved. Control that isn't grounded in understanding will eventually collapse under its own weight. The next chapter would test whether the HOA could adapt to that reality or continue unraveling under the pressure it created. What finally broke the illusion wasn't another letter or another meeting. It was inconvenience. The kind that reaches people where rules and speeches never do. One morning, without warning, a section of the block woke up to utility trucks parked along the corridor, crews in reflective vests moving with purpose, cones placed where decorative certainty once lived. There was no emergency, no outage, but there was disruption, and disruption has a way of clarifying priorities. The work was routine, scheduled as part of the corrective process, but to the residents it felt invasive. Back gates that had been ignored for years were opened. Paths that had narrowed quietly over time were reclaimed. Crews didn't ask permission from the HOA before moving obstacles. They cited the easement and kept working. For the first time, homeowners watched authority bypass the board entirely. That moment landed harder than any report. People had grown used to the HOA being the highest visible power in their daily lives. Seeing it rendered irrelevant, even temporarily, unsettled them. The board's absence during the work spoke volumes. They weren't consulted. They weren't directing traffic. They were observers, just like everyone else. Complaints surfaced immediately, but they went nowhere. Calls to the HOA were met with careful explanations about jurisdiction and compliance. Calls to utilities were met with firm statements about access rights. The difference in tone was unmistakable. One spoke in reassurance and delay, the other spoke in action and certainty. Conversations shifted. Residents stopped asking whether the HOA could stop what was happening and started asking why the HOA hadn't prevented it in the first place. That question spread quietly but relentlessly, changing how people evaluated past decisions. The board's authority had always felt personal, immediate, and enforceable. Now it felt small compared to systems that operated without emotion or exception. The realization was uncomfortable. Many homeowners had supported strict enforcement because it gave them a sense of order. They believed control equaled stability. Watching that control overridden by infrastructure needs forced them to confront a harder truth. Stability comes from understanding systems, not dominating neighbors. The block itself began to change. People talked more openly, not just about the current situation, but about years of quiet frustration. Old fines, selective enforcement, decisions that never quite made sense but were accepted because questioning them felt risky. With the board weakened, those stories surfaced, connecting into a pattern that had always been there but rarely acknowledged. The HOA tried to reassert relevance by positioning itself as a liaison, a necessary intermediary between residents and external authorities. The attempt failed. Liaisons require trust, and trust had been eroded by the board's earlier certainty and later hesitation. People bypassed the HOA when they could, seeking answers directly from sources that had proven reliable. I watched the block absorb this shift in real time. The energy wasn't angry anymore. It was reflective, almost embarrassed. Communities built on enforcement rarely stop to ask whether the rules serve them or simply discipline them. Now, that question hung in the air, unavoidable. The fence, once the center of attention, had become symbolic in a way no one mentioned out loud. It stood as a quiet marker of where authority actually ends. Not where it claims to, not where it wishes to, but where law, infrastructure, and recorded reality draw the line. By the end of the week, the board announced a pause on non-essential enforcement actions. The message framed it as consideration for the community during a transitional period. The wording was careful, but the meaning was clear. The HOA no longer felt safe asserting power it couldn't fully justify. The block had learned something fundamental. Power that relies on intimidation collapses when confronted with systems that don't negotiate. Control that isn't rooted in understanding invites scrutiny. And once scrutiny begins, it doesn't stop at the original complaint. As this chapter closed, the neighborhood felt different, quieter, but not calmer. The certainty that once defined it was gone, replaced by awareness. The next chapter would reveal whether the HOA could survive that awareness or whether the block would move beyond the need for control altogether. The collapse didn't come from the outside anymore. It came from within. Once the block understood that the HOA power had limits, the board's greatest enemy became its own history. Every decision, every approval, every enforcement action that had once been accepted without resistance was now being re-examined through a harsher lens. Homeowners who had stayed quiet for years began requesting records, minutes, and documentation, not out of malice, but out of a newly discovered sense of self-protection. The questions weren't emotional. They were procedural, precise, and relentless. The board struggled to keep up. Requests that once would have been dismissed were now legally valid. Transparency, long treated as a courtesy, became an obligation. As records surfaced, inconsistencies appeared. Approvals granted to some homeowners but denied to others. Exceptions made quietly. Rules enforced selectively. None of it was shocking on its own, but together it painted a picture of authority exercised unevenly and without sufficient oversight. Internal tension followed. Board members began distancing themselves from past decisions, speaking carefully about actions taken before their tenure, before policies were updated, before circumstances changed. Responsibility blurred. Unity fractured. Meetings grew longer and less productive as members debated language instead of solutions. The confidence that once allowed them to present a unified front evaporated under scrutiny. Homeowners noticed the shift immediately. The board that once spoke with a single voice now contradicted itself in subtle ways. Statements were revised, commitments were softened, explanations changed depending on who was asking. That inconsistency did more damage than any external pressure ever could. People stopped believing in the board's authority, not because it had been challenged, but because it could no longer define itself clearly. Whispers of resignation circulated at first quietly, then openly. The role that once offered a sense of control now carried risk, liability, exposure, accountability. Serving on the board was no longer about enforcing standards. It was about defending past choices under a spotlight no one had anticipated. The HOA attempted to stabilize by proposing reforms. Committees were formed. Policies were rewritten. Promises of future diligence were made. But reform feels hollow when it arrives only after consequences. Homeowners listened politely, then asked harder questions. Why hadn't this diligence existed before? Why did it take external oversight to prompt responsibility? The board had no satisfying answers. The neighborhood itself grew more independent. People coordinated directly with utilities. They shared information openly. They stopped waiting for permission to understand their own environment. The HOA, once the central node of authority, became just another participant, often a step behind. Through it all, the original conflict felt distant, almost irrelevant. The fence still stood, unchanged, a silent witness to a transformation that had outgrown it. What began as an attempt to assert dominance over a boundary had exposed something far larger, a system built on assumption rather than comprehension. By the time the chapter closed, the board's future was uncertain. Whether it would survive in a diminished role or unravel completely was no longer the central concern. The block had learned that power doesn't come from titles or letters or threats. It comes from alignment with reality. And once that lesson takes hold, it can't be unlearned. The next chapter would show what happens when a community decides whether it still needs the kind of control it once accepted without question. By the time the neighborhood reached what felt like a new normal, it was clear that the HOA no longer occupied the center of daily life. It still existed on paper, still sent emails, still referenced bylaws and procedures, but its presence had become peripheral, almost ceremonial. Homeowners read messages without urgency, questioned directives without fear, and made decisions without waiting for approval. What once felt mandatory now felt negotiable, and that shift changed everything. The block didn't become chaotic or careless, as the board had always warned might happen without strict oversight. Instead, it became deliberate. People took responsibility for understanding their own properties, their own risks, and their own obligations. Conversations about maintenance, access, and shared concerns happened directly between neighbors, without the filter of enforcement. The fear that once kept people compliant was replaced by something quieter but more durable: awareness. The board tried to reassert relevance by reminding residents of covenants and standards, but the reminders landed differently now. People asked whether those standards aligned with county rules, utility requirements, and recorded realities. They asked what authority actually supported each directive. These questions weren't hostile. They were practical, and practicality is difficult to overpower with rhetoric. The HOA influence continued to shrink as its claims were tested and found wanting. Some board members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. Others stayed on, but their posture changed. They spoke less. They enforced cautiously. They avoided confrontation unless absolutely necessary. The transformation was stark. The same board that once threatened removal of my fence now hesitated to send even the mildest notice. Aware that every action could invite scrutiny they could no longer control. Homeowners noticed and adjusted accordingly. The social dynamics of the block shifted in subtle ways. People who had once been silent began participating. People who had once relied on the HOA to speak for them learned to speak for themselves. The neighborhood didn't fracture. It recalibrated. The idea that order required domination faded, replaced by the understanding that order can exist without constant pressure. The fence, still standing exactly where it had always been, faded fully into the background. It no longer symbolized conflict. It symbolized a line that had forced a system to reveal its limits. Looking back, it was clear that the HOA hadn't lost power because of a single legal move or inspection. It had lost power because it had mistaken compliance for consent and intimidation for legitimacy. Once those illusions cracked, authority became optional. As this chapter closed, the neighborhood stood in a space the HOA had never planned for, one where rules existed, but fear did not, and where control was no longer assumed simply because it had once gone unchallenged. The final chapter would bring the story to its quiet conclusion, not with victory or defeat, but with a lasting lesson written into the block itself. The end didn't arrive with celebration, and it didn't arrive with collapse. It arrived the way real endings usually do, quietly, after the noise has exhausted itself, and everyone involved has learned what they needed to learn. The HOA still existed, technically intact, still capable of sending notices and hosting meetings, but it no longer defined the neighborhood's emotional climate. Its presence had become administrative rather than authoritative, a structure that managed paperwork instead of people. The block adjusted to this change with surprising ease. Without constant enforcement hovering in the background, residents became more thoughtful about their choices, more willing to communicate directly, more invested in understanding how their properties actually functioned within the larger system. The fear that had once driven compliance was gone, and with it went the resentment that fear always breeds. In its place grew a quieter form of order, one based on awareness rather than intimidation. People maintained their homes not because they were watched, but because they understood the consequences of neglect. They respected boundaries not because fines loomed, but because boundaries made sense when explained honestly. The HOA, stripped of its inflated self-image, settled into a smaller role, one that required collaboration instead of command. Board members who remained learned restraint the hard way. They consulted before acting. They documented instead of assuming. They asked instead of threatened. The memory of scrutiny lingered like a scar, shaping every future decision. The fence that had sparked the conflict stood unchanged, weathered slightly now, blending into the landscape as if it had always belonged there. In truth, it always had. It was never the fence that caused the disruption. It was the assumption that authority could extend beyond its rightful limits without consequence. That assumption collapsed under the weight of reality, not because someone fought loudly, but because someone refused to step aside when pressured. The neighborhood learned that power isn't proven by how quickly it can punish, but by how well it aligns with law, function, and truth. The HOA learned that control without understanding is fragile, and that intimidation invites scrutiny rather than obedience. And the block learned something even more valuable, that systems meant to serve people fail when they forget their purpose. In the end, no one won in the way people expect stories like this to end. There was no public apology, no dramatic reversal, no single moment of triumph. There was only a recalibration, a return to proper scale. The HOA became what it was always supposed to be, and nothing more. The neighborhood became quieter, steadier, less tense. And the lesson settled into the soil beneath the houses, as permanent as the easement lines and survey pins that had always been there, waiting for someone to remember they mattered.